tell you a little bit about Dee Carney. Dee is a consultant for Moat Casey, and she comes from the world of education and has lived in the world of accountability, working very closely with accountability people like Natalie and think tanks all over Texas. So she does bring a wealth of knowledge, and we're just so excited that she did run this risk load analysis for her. So we know that you've got some background on it, so without further ado, I'm going to bring up Dee Carney.
Good evening, President Williams, trustees, Superintendent Chambers. Thank you for the opportunity to come and talk about this innovative work that we started with Alief ISD last month. It's called a risk load analysis, but really it's a different way to look at students' educational needs. It's a different way for school leaders to allocate resources. And when we talk about allocating resources, we're talking about a different way of allocating people, money, materials, and time. Because, as you are well aware, leaders at every level of the school system are being challenged to think and act differently to successfully address the effects of income inequality and educational difficulties on academic performance. Oh, there we go. Let me go back this way. There it is. When you look, and the data we used is from 2017-18, and the district provided us with most of the data we'll be talking about. You can look at the percent of economically disadvantaged students enrolled across the campuses ranged from 59% to 93%. And when we talk about a risk load analysis, we're really talking about poverty is not just a lack of money. We're expanding the definition of poverty. We're expanding the definition of educationally disadvantaged. It's not an excuse for poor teaching or poor school performance. It does, however, serve as a shorthand for a lack of educational experiences. The most readily available and consistent operational definition, a long-standing proxy for educationally disadvantaged, is free and reduced price meals. Who turns in their form? Right? And that's known as economically disadvantaged. But in my classroom, in my 8th grade math classroom, I could have a student who qualified and turned in their form. In fact, I did. A student who was living week to week in a car with her mom. And then I had another student who turned in that same form, whose mom stayed at home and chose to stay at home, and dad was working blue-collar construction. They both turned in the form for free and reduced price meals, but in terms of educationally disadvantaged, there's just a vast difference that is not captured just by turning in that form. So when we look at, so when we talk about a risk load analysis, it's really, we ask the question, what's in our students' data backpack? What do they bring with them to school every day? Think of a clear backpack. What are they bringing with them? There we go. And if you look in your notebook, you should have a notebook. If you look in your notebook on page 46, you'll see that we have 26 different factors, or risk loads. And this risk load equals this degree of educational difficulty. And on page 46, some of the different factors that you see you may not be familiar with. If you look at factor number 3, it's called persistently disadvantaged students. The University of Indiana has done some research around persistently disadvantaged students, which means students who repeatedly qualify year after year for free lunch, not reduced lunch, for free lunch. And the research has shown those students who are persistently disadvantaged can be up to 3 grade levels behind their peers. So that's one of the factors we look at. All 26 factors are from the educational research, and they're correlated to their impact on students' performance and progress and engagement. We also look at, if you'll look at factor number 12, we look for student chronic absenteeism. And notice the definition there. The definition is students who are absent for any reason. Even if they're participating in extracurricular activities, we're looking for absenteeism. Not for funding, but for instructional purposes. Because school-dependent students, right, may need that consistent daily instruction. We also look at teacher attendance, teacher absenteeism. Again, absent for any reason. And then if you look at the bottom section, the neighborhood factors, those are based on census data. Those are the factors within the student's neighborhood based on their home address. So these 26 factors are combined to create risk loads. In your binder, if you look beginning on page 7, we talk about observations and initial findings. And because there's so many campuses here in Alief, we have secondary campus observations and findings and elementary observation and findings. And I won't go through all of them, we just highlighted a few here for you. But in the secondary campuses, the most commonly occurring student demographic factor were percentages of persistently disadvantaged students, and then the next most frequent was the number of languages spoken. In the elementary, looking at those student demographic risk factors, the most common were percentages of ELL students, and the next most frequent were the percentages of students who qualify for free lunch. When you look at school-based risk factors, on page 46, that chart, the school-based risk factors in the center, for secondary campuses, the most commonly occurring was student suspensions, and the next most common was student chronic absenteeism. And then for elementary, the most commonly occurring school-based risk factors were counselor to student ratios, and the second most common factor was teacher absenteeism and teacher turnover. We also noted in the report that there were 3 high schools and 1 middle school that had a combination of these school factors. They had high rates of student suspensions, student chronic absenteeism, and teacher absenteeism. So really we're trying to get at who is teaching whom. Who is teaching whom? And in elementary, we noted there were 2 intermediate schools that have comparatively high rates of student suspensions and teacher absenteeism, and 4 elementary schools have the highest level of risk associated with teacher absenteeism. And I'll show you what that looks like on a heat map. But first, let's look at the scatter plot. So when we take all the campuses and we look at student suspensions, and this is from the 17-18 school year, when you look at the student suspensions, it ranges from 0 to 56% of students being suspended across the campuses. When you look at student chronic absenteeism, and again, this is for any reason, student chronic absenteeism ranges from 2% to 58%. And then when you look at teacher absenteeism across the campuses, it ranges from 38% to 98%. And what we talk about here is typically we've done risk load analysis for 15 different districts. When we talk about teacher absenteeism, when the district disaggregates the data, what they see typically is it has to do with professional development. Sometimes it's things we do to ourselves as far as pulling teachers out for professional development, right? So again, our question that we're answering, or trying to answer, is who is teaching whom? Who's at the front of the classroom and who's in the classroom? When you look at the census data, the neighborhood factors, The most commonly occurring neighborhood factor among the secondary campuses were single-parent households, adults having no more than a high school diploma, and students residing in low-income housing. And in elementary, the most common neighborhood risk factor was also adults not having more than a high school diploma, and low percentages of home ownership. That shows mobility, right? And in the census data, it shows mobility. So when we take those factors, and I'll show you what it looks like in a heat map, but we take those factors across the campuses, and we look and count how many of those risk factors are there. And it ranged from a risk factor of 1, a campus has a risk load of 1, up to a campus that has a risk load of 19. There's only 26 risk factors, and a couple of your campuses are at 19, 18, and 17. So again, a risk load analysis makes it clear that schools may have this similar levels of free and reduced price meals, but they have very different challenges. We also like to remind people that risk loads do not predetermine performance. So when you look at it from an accountability perspective, you can see, well, it's way over here, but the campus with the risk load of 1 received a B this past year in the accountability system, but so did the campus with the risk load of 19. You can see one of the campuses with a risk load of 8 received an F in the accountability system. Campus with the risk load of 17 did as well. And then a C, a 9, and a 14. So risk loads do not predetermine performance. We also look at intensity. And if you'll look on page 15 in your notebook, let's talk about a heat map. Let's talk about this visualization of the risk factors. And just really quickly, you'll see across the top the student demographic factors, and in the orange section are the school factors, and the gray is the neighborhood factors. But the color coding comes from the comparing of campuses to the district. And green means there's less risk all the way to red, which is more risk. The intense red is 2 standard deviations above the average. It can be 2, 3, 4, or 5. The darker the red, the farther away, the more risk it is in that particular factor. And then on the far right side, we put the STAR performance data for the 2018, so you can see how the performance of those campuses for achievement at meets grade level and growth compares to the state. And then you can see the heat map. Now in your notebook, you have both heat maps with numbers and without. But again, it expands the definition from beyond free and reduced price meals to looking at factors and challenges within those schools that are not readily apparent if all you're doing is looking at one column of numbers. On page 23, there's some scatter plots that you may be interested in. They're three-dimensional scatter plots, meaning you can see the risk factors and you can see the percent of economically disadvantaged students that are enrolled at those campuses, and you can also see the overall performance score from the accountability system. And then we've also included control charts on page 25. But I'm going to stop there and see if you guys have any questions or thoughts.
So going back to a couple of slides on your map where you had plots for going back on the slide where you have plots for the campuses and said these campuses were that way. So that's if they would have gotten a grade this year or last year.
Yes, ma'am. You know how they received a numeric score?
Right.
We just put in the grade that would be associated with that numeric score from TEA. And you can see that on your heat maps as well. On page 25, you can see those, the campus name, and the score from the 2018 accountability system.
had a conversation where we're doing accountability, and you know, you look at the numbers, and you look at a campus that's an F or whatever, and you, on paper, it looks like an F. It has all this stuff. But you go visit the campus, and it doesn't look like it's an A or a B, and it's doing some really good things out there. So the numbers don't always, in my opinion, represent what's really happening on there. It's numbers, you know, and I know, you know, I know HD, just kind of another analogy, HD and I talk about, you know, kids. You know, I mean, I'm always baffled to see, you know, kids that have, you know, not talking about just an elite, but just kids in like valedictorians, you know, and you look at it, well, they're, you know, both parents are working, they both of them have PhDs, they have everything given, you know, have availability to them, you know, and they're barely graduated. Then you get a child that's gone through so many loss of parents, have been immigrants or, you know, whatever, and don't have the funds, and they got 4.7 GPA, you know, and it's like, how do you can't really put your finger on it of what's the right, you know what I'm saying, I don't know, what's the right recipe, you know, to do that, and so I just.
So risk load, that's a great analogy. The risk loads are trying to help you get at that recipe by looking at a variety of factors that aren't readily available for you to see. Whenever we talk to principals, it doesn't matter which district we've been in. When the principals look at their risk loads, right? They look at their individual risk loads and they go, we always hear this comment, I knew that. I knew that in my gut about my kids, but I never had the data to support that, right? And now, you know, some campuses, some districts make different staffing decisions based on risk loads. I know a peer district close to you has done just that. They used to have, you know, one of those straight staffing formulas. Not saying you have to do it, I'm just telling you what they did using their risk load data. They could support not following those straight staffing guidelines because there were some campuses with very high risk loads where they needed lower class sizes. They needed different types of instructional support than a campus down here with low risk loads. And they were able to shift, again, people, money, materials, time, based on the needs for that particular campus. We have another campus who used the risk load data to apply for some mental health grants. Right? And we're able to deploy some social workers, not to every campus, but to the high risk load campuses that needed additional support. Right? So those are just a couple of examples that we hear back from superintendents and staff as to how they're using risk loads.
One thing, Mr. Marino, that goes to your question, it's a deeper conversation than just risk loads, but it's the data being used to determine accountability in Texas right now. So I don't want to get into a testing conversation, but if we were to ever see a more robust accountability system that takes into account some of the things you witness when you walk into the campus, it makes you say, this doesn't look like a failing campus. This doesn't feel like a failing. These kids are not acting like, it's because that's not measured in accountability, and so it's kind of a misleading. But if you're basing it on test scores, and this is what we have right now, and we'll do the best we can with test results and attempt to make a more meaningful accountability system that takes into consideration some of those other things.
It's like graduation rates in the past where something like that. Some people decide they want to move into a neighborhood or a community based on graduation rates and the success of that. They look and say, oh, you got a graduation rate, you know, I'm not going to move into there. But, you know, you look at the students, you know, they're succeeding, they're going on to higher level, they're going to military, they're working, they're, you know, so forth. And have to, you know, go beyond the numbers.
The risk loads tell you about the child. They paint a better picture than what we know right now, what they're facing. What doesn't tell you how they're performing is the current accountability system. In my opinion, that's the huge gap that would even make what Dee's describing even more powerful.
I mean, just a final, I'm sorry, I'm just shocked on how we'd have maybe, I would have thought that most of our campuses would have been like equal across, you know, like 14s across or something across, but to have one, you know, campuses like 2 or 3 of them that have just one, you know, one factor, you know, and I mean, we've been to most of the campuses, and I'm really shocked to see, you know, I like to know what those 2 or 3 campuses are that only have one factor.
It shows you on your heat map on, you know, in your binder, it shows you the campus name and then the total risk load.
That's
Because
what showing I'm not big in these numbers.
any shade of pink, any shade of red is counted as a risk load factor. Right? So when you look at your heat maps, any shade of red will count. Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to go back to the absentee information.
Yes, ma'am.
What is the denominator that you're using to determine that percentage? What are we basing that on? Is it like students who are absent from 0 to 5 days, 5 to 15 days, more than 18 days?
Right, so I'm just going to refer you back because you'll get this question as well. If you look back on page 45, that gives you the definition. And then we ask the district to send us that data. So when you look at student chronic absenteeism, it's the percentage of students who miss 18 or more days of school for any reason.
And that's what these percentages are?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So it says for any reason, so
Yes.
did you find that there's like a similarity between these campuses that have high absenteeism and high suspensions?
We did, and you'll see when you look on those heat maps, you can see at a glance, and that's what's part of our observation and findings, is there were 3 high schools and a couple of intermediates that had high suspensions, high chronic absenteeism. And
For students and teachers?
yes, ma'am.
But the absenteeism for teachers, not necessarily just being out sick or taking a personal day, it can be pulled away for personal development.
That's
You know,
correct.
so
It's
I
for
know-
any
I was
reason.
kind of nervous, you know, sometimes we think, well, let's get them some more training, but it's actually, it's kind of like a double-edged sword. Yes, you're helping them, but you're also hurting the classroom.
You have to, I had, not in this district, but in another district, I had 2 principals sitting side by side, and they both had very similar teacher absenteeism rates, and principals take that to heart. And then they were comparing, as they do, comparing their performance. And one principal said, well, my campus is doing fine. And the other one said, I'm not, right? And then we looked at their teacher absenteeism rates, which were similar as well. And then I said, but now look at your total risk factors. One campus had very high risk loads, right? And I said, your students need the best professional in front of them every day. They're what we call school-dependent kids. At this other campus, they were low risk loads. Even though teachers were out for any reason about the same, low risk loads, right? This campus wasn't, those students weren't as dependent upon that teacher and that instruction, it appeared, than this one was. Again, that's information you get when you dig a little bit deeper in a risk load analysis, right?
Ms. Bowman?
So my question is, thank you for the data. It is very eye-opening, and it does explain a lot of things that you see in our communities if you drive around and are in different places where you see what's going on, right? My question is, have you ever looked at it over a period of time? Have you ever done a snapshot where you've done like a 5-year study and looked and been able to see that this is a continuing issue and not just maybe like a one-time snapshot kind of thing that's happening? Right?
That's
Because
a
obviously
great
we're seeing
question. Yeah.
Well, accountability rating is just something that's brand new, but are these campuses struggling over a period of time? Are we seeing the same risk load factors? So when I was looking at the map a couple of weeks ago, and I noticed that I could see in certain neighborhoods where the crime was higher, all these other things that, you know, will affect the kids' learning, I noticed that your data supported that. So I was just curious, had y'all ever looked at it from a multiple?
Right, so we've been running risk load analysis in Texas now. We've just begun our 4th year. We have 2 districts that partner with us to do a risk load analysis every year, right? And in those particular 2 districts, we've seen some things change, right? In the neighborhoods, as they've shifted boundaries for their schools, right? That's one change. But then when you get to the school-related factors, because that's one conversation we have when we talk to principals and staff, is, you know, really look at what's within your circle of control. And looking at those school factors, if you can reduce student chronic absenteeism or reduce how teachers are handling professional development, that's one thing within their control. So yes, for those 2 particular districts, we've seen that, but we haven't done it over 5 years. But just to let you know, we also provide all this data to Natalie, And so she has it, and she can put in a variety of other factors that you may feel are important that aren't covered in these 26 factors here. Or instead of star results, you might want to use early literacy results. So she has that data and can do some different things with it as well.
Awesome. So my other thing that I noticed was that you didn't use like mobility as one of the first and second highest things when you were looking at comparing like the elementary to secondary. So was that not one of the, because obviously that wasn't one of the top factors.
Yeah, so we do include it. Yeah, it's on your, on page 45. It's factor number 5. We do look at non-continuously enrolled, but it did not appear as some of those top factors, right, as the most commonly found factor. Is it in there? Absolutely. And you can see the effect on those heat maps of some of those campuses.
Right.
But overall, when we're looking at common factors for the observation and findings, it was not in the top 2 or 3 for the whole district, right? All the campuses. Yeah. Great question.
Okay, so my question would be, risk load, here's how I interpret it, that it's being utilized instead of like testing standards, so to speak. Or not, that's just, I'll give you my interpretation. Because I've been hearing the song risk load, and I've been trying to figure out where does that fit into district. It's something new, it's innovative, okay? So, and trying to understand in what areas. And I heard you state that there are some districts who change their staffing because of risk loads. So how do they, I'm trying to paint a picture of how do they utilize that data and what's so different about the data that they already have that makes this unique.
So one example they've given me, right, these are anecdotal stories they give me, is at the beginning of the school year, you know how, well, in most districts that I've worked in, you have to shuffle teachers around at the beginning of the year to balance your class loads, right? In that particular district telling me the story how they use their data, they made an intentional decision they would not move teachers from high-risk load campuses. They wanted the smaller class sizes at the high-risk load campuses, and they would move teachers from other campuses with lower risk loads to help staff and equalize class loads. That's just one example that they've given me.
So I guess when I said instead of using testing standards, by standards, when a school year begins, principal will begin looking at those testing standards. So their ability to look at risk loads is based upon what? And again, this is new. So I guess by the district saying, hey, we now have an individual or a group that's going to bring you risk loads, so you can look at your risk load factors. Then they're saying, oh, yes, I agree with that. Let me, revamp my schedule according to that. Let me put place programs in schools because of risk load factors. I'm kind of hitting in the dark. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, you're saying, okay, so what?
Yeah.
What's
next?
What do we do with this?
What's next?
And that's the question that we haven't, as a council, we've talked about it, but we didn't get too far down the road because of needing to have a conversation with you guys. But what are the,
I don't mean to interrupt, and it's not the fact that I don't think that this is important. It is greatly important. I think every one of us here are saying, just what we thought, But how to take this data and now use it, there is a great concern that people will rely upon this and what happens with testing as well. Because at the end of the day, the state still has to, a demand on us that has no conversation about this one.
so I'll let Ava chime in with this, but the question, some of the obvious responses to that would be exactly what he said. Some of it's staffing, because a lot of times we use.
Item number 11 on the agenda.
Okay. Annual performance report. Tonight we're going to have Natalie Martinez, our Director of Accountability and Assessment. She's going to conduct a public hearing and report on the 2017-18 data as listed in the TAPR, and I'll let her share with you what that is.
Good evening, Board and Mr. Chambers. Tonight we will review our 2017-2018 academic data from the Texas Academic Performance Report, which we frequently call the TAPER report. That is the largest part of the annual performance report. This does also serve as a public hearing, so at the end I will open up the floor to questions from the audience as well. The full report can be found on our Alief website under Departments and Accountability. You'll be able to navigate through the different campuses' TAPER reports along with their performance objectives and their summative evaluations as well. 2017-18 was a difficult year for Alief and many surrounding area districts. Harvey hit our area and Alief was closed for 10 days. Once we reopened, we welcomed children back and we quickly began meeting not only their basic needs but their academic needs as well. The state of Texas did decide to move forward with state assessment but allowed a Harvey provision for schools and districts who were closed more than 10 or more days. If a campus would have received an improvement required label, instead they received a not rated Harvey provision label. Districts with schools in this position also received the not rated Harvey provision. You'll see that Alief had 35 schools that met standard. Remember, they won't move to the A through F rating until this current year. And we had 6 schools that were not rated Harvey provision. Because of that, our district also received the not rated Harvey provision, but we did receive our numeric grade and all the data that goes with it, so I share with you as well that we received a 77. Remember, districts were rated with the A through F system where campuses won't be until this current year. Before we get into all the data, I want to review 3 things very quickly with you. The first is the accountability system. You've been exposed to this a few times, but just to refresh your memory, student achievement is domain 1. It is all about the performance on STAR. It also includes the CCMR, or the College Career Military Ready Indicators. Remember, the performance on STAR has the language of approaches, meets, and masters, and we'll review that very quickly in a minute as well. Domain 2 is all about school progress. There are 2 parts to Domain 2. The first part is growth. Remember, in the growth areas, we don't look at whether students passed or failed. We looked at did they grow from one year to the next. In 2B, it is about relative performance. They take our Domain 1 scores relative to other schools with similar economically disadvantaged populations. Domain 3 is really used to meet the federal requirements. This is the report where we start seeing all of our demographic information. We did have percentages attached to that. Remember, campuses are allowed to use the highest of Domain 1, 2A, or 2B to count as 70% of their rating, and then 30% on the closing the gap. The second review is really just where do we assess. You can see that we test all of our content areas, but not necessarily in every grade level. Remember, in high school, it is about the course that they take, not necessarily the grade they are in. You'll also notice the 10 subpopulations in yellow. Those have not changed. We still review our data by all of these subpops. There have been some new indicators that rolled around in accountability. These are not necessarily found in the TAPER reports, but they are in the accountability reports. So it gives us another view on how to disaggregate our data. Hopefully you remember this third review, we looked at our stick figures. We ran that through with the board. Hopefully that was an easy way to understand that all kids matter. Even if kids are already passing, our job is to still focus on their needs and push them to those master levels. In the end, the AMM average stands for approaches, meets, and masters averaged together. So you'll see in that example, we took our percent approaches, percent meets, and percent masters. We added them and divided by 3 to get 57 as an example. That approaches, meets, and master average is found throughout this entire accountability system. So now that your brain is ready, let's dig into the TAPER academic data. We like to start with the demographic information, which is in the TAPER report. You'll notice all of the state demographics side by side with our Alief demographics. To show a quick comparison, because we do like to compare ourselves to the state, you'll notice that our ECD POP is significantly higher than the state. It is, however, lower than last year. If you remember, we moved to an online system, and we found that some parents were having difficulties with that system. This year, we had a push at the beginning of the year for the paper versions as well, so hopefully we meet the needs of the children, because they're actually, as you heard Dee say, turning in the form. And so we should see that number go back up. You'll also see a difference in our ELL learners. That percentage, again, significantly higher than the state level. It also increased 1 percentage point from the prior year as well. Knowing that we are different from the state, we still like to compare our numbers. Here are Alief ISD numbers compared to state when we look at our AMM averages. In reading, for example, remember reading is from grades 3 to English 2. You'll see that our AMM average was a 39 compared to the state at a 46. You'll see all of our content AMM averages there, and on average we're about 8 points below the state, so we know that there's work to be done. It's in progress right now as well. Another perspective that we bring to the table, just to help you build your perspectives on how we're performing, we look at Houston area districts as well. I want to start with demographics again, because I find that to be important to build the whole picture of what we're talking about. Enrollment, of course, UCHISD with biggest numbers, Cy-Fair following behind them, but really we want to focus into mobility, ELL, and ECD in these districts. When we look at mobility, you'll notice that Alief has the highest in this small group of districts that surround us, followed by Houston ISD and then Spring ISD as well. With our ELL population, you'll notice again, Alief has the highest ELL population for this sample group of districts, followed by Aldine and Spring Branch. And last, with our ECD pop, Aldine was at the top. Alief fell in second place with that one, and then followed by Pasadena. When we look at academics with that lens, I'll give you the 3 different sub-pops rank ordered here. Your AMM averages are not going to change, right? That is what it is, but I rank ordered it for you just to give you that perspective. So you'll see in this case, we re-ranked all of our districts based on mobility. Remember, Alief had the highest mobility. In general terms, the trends that we would see is the higher mobility you have, the lower your AMM averages. We did have the highest mobility, but we do not have the lowest scores. So you'll see those AMMs shift, but they're not going to change. When we look at the different POPs, here's your English language learners. Again, you'll find that we re-ranked these so the districts are in a different order. But again, general trend would say higher the ELL POP, lower your AMM average, and that's just not the case when we look at our scores. And same holds true when we look at our economically disadvantaged. In addition to academic data, table also reports on our CCMR data, which is college, career, military ready. Here again are the same districts for comparison. The calculation of CCMR is new, but most of the pieces have been in place for quite some time. The calculation is a percent of annual graduates who meet one of the CCMR indicators. You'll see that 42% of our annual grads met at least one CCMR indicator. Underneath that, however, I give you these bullets where it's giving you individual percentages for those CCMR indicators. So for example, 32% of Alief students met both the ELA and the math TSI criteria. That TSI includes SAT, ACT, and TSI. But the key word there is and. They have to meet both ELA and math. But you'll see our percentages down there as well. This report really has caused lots of discussion, not only in our district, but at the state level as well. Certifications, for example, is one of the hot topics where not all of the certifications were included on the approved list. So although our students were getting certified, if the certification was not on the state approved list, they weren't counted here. The state approved list had 77, roughly, certifications, where now they've heard us. They're talking about 200 certifications. So we know that they're listening. We know that there are some adjustments to be done to the CCMR report. We're making our own adjustments internally here at the district, but we're also being very vocal at the state level to let them know how we feel and what's going on in our district. Growth measurement is a part of the TAPER report as well, so I'll show you math and reading, just ranked differently. Remember, growth is just about growing from one year to the next, not necessarily about passing. But you see when we rank order by math, we're in the top 5, which feels really good. When we go to reading, we do dip down, but you'll see that there's a tight race between districts there. Very similar performance. The TAPER also reports on our demographic data. And we've had lots of questions on demographic data. Domain 3 is where you want to go if you're looking at information in that way. So you'll see here, I pulled one piece of Domain 3, which was our Domain 1 score divided out into subpopulations. So our domain now is broken down into all of those subpops on the left-hand side. Now you'll also notice that each subpop has a different target that was set by baseline data from the 2017 school year. So for example, when I look at domain 1, it's all kids put together. If I throw domain 1 into domain 3, I then can separate it out by subpopulation. For the African American population, which is first on our list, the target is 36 for that domain 1 score. Alief was hitting at a 40. Remember, your domain 1 score is your approaches, meets, and masters. It's also your CCMR, your graduation rate, all combined for a district level. So you'll see the green check marks where we are meeting those standards, and we certainly look at that information to see where we can make some adjustments. This is the shortened version of the TAPER report and the annual performance report. Remember, the entire report is already loaded into the Alief webpage. You'll see a link for district and then a link for each level with all campuses included in that report. Board, I'll ask you for questions first. I'll ask it of you first.
Rob, Mr. Moreno, any questions? So no questions at this time.
Perfect. Okay, I'll take questions from the audience.
I have a question.
Sure.
Heard a lot being talked about mobility. My concern is that it was highlighted in your presentation. The lady that spoke earlier said that it was ranked number 5 in the concerns as far as the academic performances. So I'm wondering why we continue to highlight that, especially when the district goes by a pacing guide. At the beginning of the school year, you brought the top percentage of students from each campus here, and each one of them, every last one of them, had a high mobility rate. So my concern is that we're not focusing on a proper area. We're continuing to highlight high mobility when we've shown that that is actually minimal problem compared to, I think the young lady said, absenteeism of the students and the teachers. And then we missed the board discussed professional development being given during the middle of the day, that being a problem, and then it was kind of whitewashed by saying the professional development was given in the afternoons and on the weekends. Well, that's still a situation. If you're working your teachers to death throughout the week and then you have them going on professional development after working on the weekends, yeah, they're going to take some time off during the week. So I think that we're not addressing the elephant in the room, and you all keep trying to put the earnest on mobility. If I go and eat McDonald's on the south side of Houston, I can go on the north side of Houston and the french fries are going to taste the same because they cook them the same way. That's the same way that our school structure is supposed to be with this pacing guide. So focusing on mobility, I think, is a crutch and not addressing the elephant in the room.
It is one indicator that we highlighted today. This is actually the first year that I put mobility into the report, and the reason I did that was because the state put continuously enrolled and non-continuously enrolled in our accountability realm. So because we've had talks about continuously enrolled, I wanted to bring that to the table as well. But we also include ELL, which is a huge population. We also include ECD, which is a huge population. I welcome conversations about the taper. It's one of my favorite reports. So I would love to have more conversations with you and anybody who would like to dig deeper. Now, the professional development piece is not in the taper report. That's a separate and aside, but it does contribute to our numbers. I agree. It's something that we're looking at centrally and something that we're already discussing with principals to address.
And mobility is an issue. It's not a crutch. I don't know about french fries and how they taste from one McDonald's to another, but I know when students leave one campus and move to another campus, that does have an impact on their ability. Is it the only impact? No. Is it an excuse? No.
So is the pacing guide ineffective?
I'm sorry?
Is doing the pacing guide ineffective? Is that what you're saying? That doing the pacing guide is...
No, pacing guides are important, very important, but they don't overcome the social, emotional, and academic problems that some children have when they're uprooted from a school and moved to another school, whether it's in the same district or from Alief to another school district. When a second grader gets moved, they don't know they're moving from one Alief school to another Alief school. They just know they just moved from their teacher, their friends, wherever they may be living, and they know it's different and it's new. Some students react differently. But many of these students who are coming from either economically disadvantaged backgrounds or they don't speak the English language very well, it is a tremendous impact. Is it the only impact? Absolutely not. No one has ever said it is, but it is an issue. And to characterize it as a crutch.
Rank number 5. All I'm saying is
it's number 5.
Before the fifth thing, but you seem to keep focusing on number 5.
No, we focus on economic development, economic disadvantage, ELL, all of them. You're hearing what you want to hear. We're dealing with all of them.
What item number 5 you're talking about?
He's talking about the risk rate factor.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if it was number 5. I just know she only gave the top 2. She only said the top 2. She didn't give the top 5. So.
Ma'am, did you say it was number 5?
She's going. Nevertheless, it's not a crutch. I don't want anyone that's listening to this to understand. It is not a crutch. It's a real thing that happens and it has an impact.
1 through 4 has a greater impact, obviously. That's what the report
Some kids it
says.
has an impact on.
Well, Ron, I have another question that you'd like to add, or any other, this is still open to the public to ask questions.
I'm just responding to the superintendent. He's having a dialogue with me, so I'm going back.
And as board president, I'm bringing it back to order, to the agenda. And it was a question, and I welcome your comments.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Natalie?
Okay, thank you very
Nice
much.
response, so thank you so very much for your report and your responses. We'll continue to hear more because accountability is a big deal for the board. And I agree with this discussion about mobility, just like Ms. Loves and everything else, all new terms. The most difficult part about all of this is what the state holds us accountable to. They kind of tie our hands on what we can and cannot do. So that's why I think now, at this time, we're throwing everything out there to say, what is the problem, what is the problem? And I agree. French fries from one McDonald's in another city to another is the same. But mobility, some people are impacted by it, some people are not. Some people have great support systems to get through it. And the truth is, some do not. So,
Yes.
thank you for sharing.
Thank you.